Marion straightened the silver tray by her door in 1954, guarding a code no textbook taught her, the kind that made a stranger feel like royalty before they left. By the early 1950s, home entertaining had become a shared language, taught by Amy Vanderbilt's 1952 Etiquette Guide and Emily Post's revised postwar editions, passed from mother to daughter at the kitchen table rather than written down as law. A hostess on a modest suburban income could still stage a flawless evening because the rules did the work instead of money. The ritual was never written down, but every good hostess knew it by heart. One of the 8 rules ahead was strict enough to end a friendship, and we are starting with the one guarding the front door. One thing before we go on, and I will not mention it again. Everything I have gathered about receiving people properly is written down plain in a little book called The Lost Art of Grace. The first link below this video will take you to it. If you would like it, it is there. That is all. The tray itself was small, often silver or cut glass, sitting on a table just inside the front hall where every guest would see it before they saw anything else. Cards were engraved or neatly printed, usually ordered from a local stationer, and a stack of them told a visitor exactly how seriously this household took its social life. A hostess checked that tray the way a modern host checks a doorbell camera, reading who had already called and who still owed her a visit. That small pile of paper was doing more work than anyone admitted out loud. This ritual did not start in the suburbs. It came down from 19th century European and East Coast society, where calling on acquaintances was a formal, almost ceremonial duty, complete with strict rules about who called on whom first. By the post-war years, those old rules had been trimmed and softened for a much bigger audience of first-time homeowners who had never had a butler and never would. What survived was a simplified, democratic version small enough to fit in a Levittown hallway. But that little card carried a code most guests never noticed, a code with its own secret language folded into one corner. A calling card was never just a name on paper. Etiquette guides taught women a small, wordless code, and the way a corner was folded down could mean a personal visit rather than one left by a servant, while the letters P, P, C in the corner meant pour prendre congé, a polite goodbye before a family moved away. None of this was explained out loud at the party. A woman simply knew it, the same way she knew which fork to use, and getting it wrong could make a newcomer look like she did not belong in the neighborhood at all. By the 1950s, a young couple did not need family money to take part. A trip to the local stationer or the stationery counter of a department store bought a modest set of printed or lightly engraved cards, priced within reach of an ordinary household budget. What had once separated old money from everyone else now separated households who cared about doing things properly from households who did not bother. And that was a distinction almost anyone could choose to be on the right side of. It did not stay that simple for long, though, because keeping the tray current was its own quiet burden. Here is the part that made it work. By the time a guest actually rang the bell, the hostess already knew who was calling because she had been tracking the tray for weeks. She could greet a near stranger by name, ask about a sister recovering from surgery, or mention a husband's new job, all before the guest had taken off her coat. It felt like magic, but it was preparation. The same preparation that shows up again and again in every one of these 8 vanished habits. Your grandmother knew how to make a room feel like home before you had even stepped inside it. Amy Vanderbilt devoted real space in her 1952 guide to exactly this system, because by then even her readers needed reminding of rules their mothers had simply absorbed by watching. She spelled out who called on newcomers first, how soon a call should be returned, and what it meant if it was not. It reads today less like etiquette and more like a maintenance manual for a neighborhood's entire social nervous system. And like any manual, it had failure modes, moments where one missed step could cost a woman her place at the table for months. Imagine a new bride who forgot to return a call within the expected week or two. It sounds small today, but in a neighborhood that ran on this silent bookkeeping, it could read as a deliberate snub, and word traveled fast over back fences and bridge tables. Some women spent years quietly working to repair a reputation dented by nothing more than a misplaced card or a delayed visit. It is easy to romanticize a system this precise, but it also asked a great deal of the women expected to run it flawlessly, every single week. The telephone is what finally broke it. As phone ownership spread through American homes across the 1950s and into the 1960s, a quick call did the job a formal visit used to do, and the tray by the door slowly stopped filling up. By the time the 1970s arrived, most young couples had never owned a set of calling cards at all, and the whole silent language quietly went extinct. It disappeared from dinner parties, but it still works, because the instinct underneath it, noticing a guest before they even ring the bell, is the same instinct that powers the next secret too. If the calling card told a hostess who was coming, the next rule told her exactly what to do the moment they arrived, and it started with a clock. Cocktail hour in a properly run 1950s home did not drift. It began at a fixed time, usually right around 6, and it ran on a schedule as tight as anything in a modern restaurant kitchen, just dressed up in highball glasses and a hand-rolled canapé instead of a ticket rail. Getting that first hour right decided whether the whole evening felt effortless or fell apart before the soup was even served. Etiquette guides of the era were surprisingly specific about timing, framing cocktail hour as a defined 60-minute window, commonly 6 to 7, that existed for a real reason beyond simply serving drinks. It protected the kitchen. A roast or a casserole had its own timeline, and if guests lingered too long over gin and conversation, dinner would overcook or arrive cold, undoing an afternoon of work in a matter of minutes. The hostess who held that hour firmly, without seeming rushed, was doing something closer to modern event management than anyone gave her credit for. None of this happened without real spending. A modest bar cart, a set of highball and old-fashioned glasses, and a bottle each of the standard spirits represented genuine discretionary income for a family living on something close to the era's median income, commonly cited around $4,000 a year in the mid-1950s. Hosting well was not a hobby for the idle rich in this decade. It was a deliberate investment an ordinary household chose to make, the same way a family might save for a car. That investment is exactly why the choreography around it mattered so much. In most guides, the husband had one clearly defined role for this hour, mixing and serving the drinks, freeing his wife to move through the room, greeting people and steering conversation instead of standing behind a bar. It was one of the few moments in the whole evening where hosting duties were explicitly split by gender in a way that actually worked in the couple's favor, letting both of them do the part they were best positioned for. Watching a husband shake a cocktail with real ceremony was, by most accounts, half the entertainment itself. Food during cocktail hour followed its own quiet rules. Canapés were small enough to eat in 1 or 2 bites without a plate, arranged on a tray that circulated the room roughly every 15 or 20 minutes so nobody stood empty-handed for long, and nothing heavy enough to spoil an appetite for the meal ahead. Deviled eggs, cheese straws, and small open sandwiches were period staples for exactly this reason. It sounds simple until you realize someone had to time every tray by hand with no timer buzzing in another room to remind her. At the hour's end, the transition into dinner was its own small performance. A hostess did not simply shout that food was ready. She moved through the room, often with a specific, gentle phrase reserved for exactly this moment, guiding guests toward the dining room in a way that felt like an invitation rather than an order. Guides warned specifically against letting this moment feel abrupt, because an abrupt shift could sour the mood built up over the previous hour in seconds. Getting 8 or 10 adults to stop talking and move together took more skill than it looked like. This whole ritual only existed because of what came before it. Prohibition had ended in 1933, and the cocktail culture that exploded afterward carried real cultural weight into the post-war years, tangled up with ideas about modernity, sophistication, and a household finally free to entertain the way it wanted. A 1950s cocktail hour was not neutral. It was a small, quiet celebration of a freedom the previous generation had not had, dressed up as an ordinary Tuesday evening among neighbors. That history is part of why the hour carried so much unspoken meaning for the people living it. Not every hour went to plan. Etiquette columns of the decade fielded genuine reader letters about guests who overstayed cocktail hour, drank past the point of good judgment, or simply lost track of time while a dinner quietly dried out in the oven. A skilled hostess had backup moves for exactly this, from a firmer verbal cue to simply beginning to serve regardless of who was still mid-conversation. The goal was never to embarrass anyone. It was to protect an evening that had taken all afternoon to build, sometimes by making a hard call nobody else in the room even noticed. Strip away the glassware and the canapes, and what remains is discipline, a fixed start time, a fixed end time, a defined role for every person in the room, and a plan for what happens if any of it slips. Modern event planners would recognize the structure instantly, even if they had never heard the phrase cocktail hour used this precisely. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and the next rule shows just how far that planning instinct actually went, all the way down to where each individual guest was allowed to sit. By the time guests moved from the living room to the dining room, the entire seating arrangement had already been decided, often days in advance, with more thought behind it than most modern hosts put into an entire wedding. Nothing about where a guest sat was left to chance. It was engineered quietly by a hostess who had studied her guest list the way a chess player studies a board, and the next secret is exactly how she did it. Some hostesses drew the seating chart before they had even finalized the menu, because in their minds the conversation of the evening mattered as much as the food on the table. A small note card or a sketch on the back of an envelope mapped exactly who sat where, and that map went through several drafts as the guest list shifted in the days before the party. It was treated less like party planning and more like solving a puzzle with real emotional stakes attached to every wrong placement. The most basic rule was alternating men and women around the table whenever possible, so no guest sat boxed in beside two people of the same sex for an entire meal. Beyond that, etiquette guides recommended separating husbands and wives, on the theory that couples who saw each other daily needed the dinner party to introduce them to someone new, not repeat a conversation they could have at home for free. It sounds almost clinical written out like this, but in practice it produced some of the liveliest dinner conversation any of these guests would have all year. A skilled hostess placed her most talkative guest near the quietest one, hoping the pairing would draw the quieter person out rather than let them disappear for the whole evening. She put a guest of honor to her own right, seated a newcomer beside someone known to be especially warm and welcoming, and kept two guests with an old grudge as far apart as the table allowed. None of this was explained to anyone at the table. Guests simply experienced an evening that somehow flowed, never realizing every seat had been chosen for a reason. Place cards were small, often handwritten in ink, folded to stand upright beside each setting, and treated as a genuine courtesy rather than a formality, because they spared a guest the small social panic of wondering where to sit in front of a room full of near strangers. A hostess with elegant handwriting was quietly admired for it, the same way a modern host might be admired for a beautifully designed invitation. It was one more small kindness folded into an evening built almost entirely out of small kindnesses like it. Sometimes the chart fell apart anyway. A last-minute cancellation could leave an odd number at the table, throwing off the whole alternating pattern, and a hostess had to improvise a fix on the spot without letting anyone see her scramble. Etiquette guides actually address this directly, offering backup patterns for exactly this situation, because the writers understood that a plan this precise was always one phone call away from chaos. The best hostesses were not the ones whose plans never broke, they were the ones whose repairs nobody ever noticed. These seating rules were not the law of the land. They varied by region, by religion, and by exactly which etiquette guide a particular household trusted most. Some kept things looser for casual suppers among close friends, and only pulled out the full chart for the biggest occasions, like a holiday dinner or a new pastor's welcome. But the underlying instinct behind all of it, that where a person sits changes how they feel in a room, shows up again and again across nearly every account from the period, no matter which region wrote it down. That same instinct about feeling considered is what made the next rule, the one about dishes, feel less like a formality and more like a message. When a party had a genuine guest of honor, a visiting relative, a new neighbor, a husband's boss, that person was placed to the hostess's immediate right without exception, a position understood by every adult at the table as a mark of real respect. Skipping this rule, even by accident, could read as a deliberate insult, especially to an older guest raised entirely inside this system. It was a small piece of geography that carried enormous social weight, decided in seconds by whoever drew up the chart days earlier. When a family gathering included children, a separate smaller table was often set up nearby, sometimes in the kitchen or a sunroom with its own simplified place setting so the adult conversation upstairs, so to speak, could run without interruption. This was not meant as exile. Children's tables came with their own small rituals, their own smaller versions of the good manners being practiced one room over, treated as training for the exact evenings they would someday host themselves. Every part of the house, it turned out, was quietly teaching someone something that night. Once everyone found their assigned seat, the very first thing in front of them told its own story before a single word of conversation began. The plate itself, whether it was the family's everyday stoneware or something considerably finer, was a signal a 1950s guest knew how to read instantly, the same way a modern guest reads a restaurant's decor the moment they walk in. Most homes actually kept more than one set of dishes for exactly this reason, and knowing which set to bring out and when was its own small art form. Most well-run 1950s households kept not one, but three distinct levels of dishware, and everyone in the family understood exactly which one meant what. Everyday dishes, often sturdy stoneware, handled ordinary family suppers without anyone worrying about a chip. Company dishes, a step up in quality, came out for neighbors and casual guests. Formal or wedding china, the finest set in the house, was reserved for the most important occasions of all, and mixing these tiers by accident was considered a genuine misstep, not a small one. That formal set usually arrived as a wedding gift, thanks to a bridal registry system that department stores like Marshall Field's had pioneered back in 1924 and expanded enormously by the 1950s. A young bride registered for a full place setting from a maker like Lenox, Take, or Franciscan, and friends and family bought individual pieces as gifts, meaning many new households started married life owning finer china than they could have afforded to buy outright themselves. Did your family receive china as a wedding gift? And if so, was it actually used for dinner parties or kept carefully stored away? Share in the comments. It was, in a sense, an entire community quietly investing in one young couple's future dinner parties. Here is the surprising part. Etiquette writers of the era were not actually telling women to hoard the good china for a someday that never came. Quite the opposite. Several guides specifically warned young brides against saving formal china so carefully that it sat untouched in a cabinet for years. arguing that dishes given as wedding gifts were meant to be used and enjoyed, not preserved behind glass like a museum piece. That advice, it turns out, was already fighting a losing battle against a habit that would eventually swallow the whole tradition. Did your own family keep a set of good china that almost never came out of the cabinet, saved for an occasion that always seemed to be just a little further down the road? I would genuinely like to hear about it in the comments, because that habit turns out to be older and more common than most people realize. It traces directly back to this exact post-war moment, when a young household suddenly owned more fine china than it had ever used in daily life, and old habits about saving the best for later took hold fast and never fully let go. A guest who understood this system could tell, within seconds of sitting down, exactly how the hostess viewed the occasion. Everyday dishes at a spontaneous Tuesday supper felt relaxed and genuine. Company dishes for a planned evening signaled real effort without overreaching. Formal china appearing at what was supposed to be a casual visit could actually feel slightly overwhelming, even a little suspicious, as though something more serious was about to be announced. The dishes themselves were doing conversational work before anyone had said a single sentence out loud. Glassware followed the same three-tier logic. Everyday tumblers handled family meals, while a set of cut or pressed glass stemware from a maker like Fostoria or Libby came out specifically for company, catching candlelight in a way ordinary glasses never could. These pieces were genuinely valued possessions, cared for, hand-washed rather than risked in whatever passed for a dishwasher at the time, and passed down through families for decades afterward. A cabinet full of good glass was, quietly, one of a household's proudest achievements. There are period stories, passed down in families more than documented in any single book, about a chipped piece of wedding china becoming a small household crisis, mourned the way a modern family might mourn a dented car. A hostess sometimes retired an entire place setting rather than let a mismatched chipped piece sit beside its perfect neighbors on the table. It sounds excessive from here, but it reflects just how much emotional weight had been quietly loaded onto a stack of painted porcelain plates. By the 1970s and 1980s, as more women worked outside the home and casual entertaining took over, that careful three-tier system started to collapse into one simplified set of dishes used for everything, or in many homes, no formal china at all. The wedding china so many brides had once registered for began gathering dust in cabinets across the country, exactly the fate those 1950s etiquette writers had warned against decades earlier. What replaced it was convenience, and convenience rarely photographs as beautifully as a table set 3 tiers deep. The dishes were only part of what a guest saw the moment they sat down. Just above the plates, at the center of the table, sat something a hostess had thought about almost as carefully as her seating chart. A centerpiece with its own strict, nearly invisible set of rules. Get the dishes right and the flowers wrong, and the whole careful effect could still fall apart. The rule governing that centerpiece came down to a single measurement nobody explained to guests, but every hostess quietly obeyed. The rule was simple to state and surprisingly strict in practice. A centerpiece could never rise higher than eye level when guests were seated, because anything taller blocked the view across the table and killed conversation between people sitting opposite each other. Etiquette guides were specific about this, sometimes recommending arrangements no taller than about a foot, low and wide, rather than tall and dramatic. And remember, one of these 8 rules was strict enough to end a friendship if it was broken. We are getting close to that one now. Flowers for a company dinner usually came from one of 2 places: a hostess's own garden if the season allowed, or a modest bunch bought from the local five and dime or a small neighborhood florist, kept within a strict, almost superstitious little budget. Overspending on flowers was considered its own quiet vanity, a sign a hostess was trying too hard rather than entertaining naturally. The goal was abundance that looked effortless, never abundance that looked expensive, and pulling that off took real skill with very little money. Because most flowers came from the garden rather than a year-round florist supply chain, centerpieces changed with the calendar in a way modern arrangements rarely do. Spring tables leaned on tulips and daffodils, summer tables used whatever the garden was overflowing with, zinnias, daisies, black-eyed Susans, and winter tables often skipped fresh flowers entirely in favor of greenery, candles, or a simple bowl of fruit. This seasonal rhythm meant a regular guest could often guess the month just by glancing at the center of the table before anyone said a word about the weather. A good hostess also thought about smell, not just height and color. Strongly scented flowers like lilies were often avoided at the dinner table, specifically because their fragrance could compete with the food, overpowering a carefully planned menu before the first course even arrived. Milder blooms, or simple greenery with almost no scent at all, were preferred instead. A small sensory detail most guests would never consciously notice, but would absolutely have felt if it had been done wrong. Every choice at that table, it turns out, was working on more than one sense at once. Beyond the centerpiece itself, guides also addressed the tablecloth and runner underneath it, recommending fabric and color that complemented the flowers rather than competed with them, and warning against patterns busy enough to clash with the good china sitting on top. White or cream linen was the safest, most common choice for formal occasions, chosen specifically because it let everything else on the table, the flowers, the china, the glassware, do the visual work instead. Restraint, again and again, turns out to be the real secret hiding inside almost every one of these rules. Because so many households were following roughly the same rulebook, a quiet, mostly friendly competition grew up around who could execute it best. Neighbors noticed each other's centerpieces, traded tips over the back fence, and occasionally borrowed a particularly nice vase for a big occasion, the same way people today might borrow a serving platter. It was never framed as competition out loud. That would have been considered poor form, but everyone involved understood exactly what was happening underneath the polite compliments. Not every arrangement succeeded. Etiquette columns fielded genuine letters about centerpieces that toppled mid-dinner, blocked a guest of honor from being seen at all, or simply wilted embarrassingly before dessert because nobody had thought to add water partway through the evening. A skilled hostess had a backup plan for this too, sometimes a smaller emergency arrangement kept in the kitchen specifically in case the main one failed. Even the flowers, it turns out, needed contingency planning. Underneath all these small rules was one consistent idea, that a centerpiece should never get in the way of the actual reason everyone was sitting at that table, which was each other. Every guideline about height, scent, and season traced back to that single principle, protecting eye contact and conversation above all else. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and almost none of it was really about the flowers at all. Once dessert was cleared and the evening wound down, the rules did not simply stop. They shifted into their final and strictest phase, one that started the moment a guest walked out the front door and did not end until a specific letter had been written, sealed, and mailed. This next rule is the one that could genuinely end a friendship if it was ignored. And by most accounts, it was taken more seriously than almost anything else on this entire list. The rule was almost absurdly strict by modern standards. A guest was expected to write and mail a thank you note within a day or two of attending a dinner party, sometimes that same evening if she was especially conscientious, thanking the hostess by name for a specific detail of the meal or the company, rather than sending a generic line. Waiting a week was already considered late. Waiting longer than that risked looking as though the invitation had not mattered enough to bother remembering. Etiquette writers described this note using language closer to debt than kindness, treating it as something genuinely owed rather than a pleasant option. Emily Post and Amy Vanderbilt both address the exact wording expected, specific enough to complement one real detail of the evening, personal enough to prove the guest had actually paid attention rather than mailing something generic. A vague or delayed note could read as an insult dressed up as politeness, and everyone at the table understood the stakes, even if nobody said so out loud. This is the rule that could genuinely end a friendship, and period accounts describe exactly that happening. A missed or late note read as a deliberate slight, severe enough that a hostess simply stopped inviting the offending guest again, sometimes without ever explaining why. It was not usually a dramatic confrontation. It was quieter and colder than that, an invitation that simply never arrived again, and a friendship that cooled without a single argument ever taking place. A proper thank you note followed a loose but recognizable structure, opening with genuine thanks, naming one specific detail, the roast, the flowers, a particular guest who had been seated nearby, and closing with warmth rather than formality. Guides warned against notes that sounded copied or rushed, because a hostess who had spent days planning could tell instantly when a thank you had taken less than 2 minutes to write. The specificity was the entire point, proof that the evening had actually landed. In some circles, a phone call the following morning supplemented rather than replaced the written note, a quick word of thanks before the more formal letter arrived by mail a day or two later. This double gesture, a call and then a note, showed a level of attentiveness that guides genuinely praised, treating it as the gold standard rather than the baseline expectation. Most guests managed one or the other. The ones who managed both were remembered as the most gracious people in the entire neighborhood. Think about how much had to happen correctly for one of these notes to land the way it was supposed to. It had to be written the same evening or the next morning, worded with real, specific detail rather than a generic line, mailed promptly rather than left sitting on a hall table. And it had to arrive while the dinner was still fresh enough in the hostess's memory to feel meaningful rather than obligatory. Miss any one of those 4 steps, and the whole gesture could lose most of its power. A genuinely gracious hostess, on receiving one of these notes, sometimes kept it, tucked into a drawer or a small box of correspondence built up over years, a private record of every evening she had successfully hosted and every friend who had noticed. Some of these boxes survive today in family archives, tucked away in attics alongside old photographs, a quiet paper trail of an entire social world that otherwise left almost nothing behind. It disappeared from dinner parties, but it still works, this idea that gratitude, written down, outlasts almost everything else about an evening. The decline of the handwritten thank you note tracks closely with the decline of handwritten correspondence generally, accelerating through the 1970s and 1980s as phone calls became easier and eventually cheaper than a stamp, and continuing into the decades since as email and texting replaced letters almost entirely. What was lost was not just paper. It was the built-in pause, the requirement to sit down, think specifically about someone else's evening, and put that thought into words worth keeping. 6 of these 8 rules are behind us now: the tray, the cocktail hour, the seating chart, the china, the flowers, and the note that could cost a friendship. 2 remain, and they both live at the very edges of the evening, the moment a gift changed hands and the moment a guest first walked through the door. Both of them, it turns out, were about the exact same thing, making sure nobody in that house ever felt like an afterthought. When a guest arrived carrying a small gift, a box of chocolates, a bottle of wine, a bouquet, the period-correct etiquette ran exactly opposite to what most people assume today. A hostess was expected to open it immediately, right there in front of the giver, rather than setting it aside politely to open later in private. Setting it aside, the modern instinct could actually read as a mild social slight, as though the gift and the guest who brought it were not quite worth the interruption. The gifts themselves followed their own quiet conventions. Flowers were common but came with a catch. A thoughtful guest sent them ahead of the party rather than handing them over at the door, sparing the hostess from having to stop mid-greeting and hunt for a vase while other guests waited behind. Wine, chocolates, and small decorative items for the home were safer choices to bring in hand. Knowing this distinction, flowers sent ahead, everything else brought along, was one more small test most guests never realized they were being quietly measured against. Opening the gift in front of the giver was only half the ritual. The hostess was also expected to acknowledge it out loud in a specific way, naming what it was, praising it genuinely, and sometimes finding a way to incorporate it into the evening itself. Chocolate set out on a tray, wine opened and poured that same night if it suited the menu. A gift left unused or unmentioned for the rest of the evening could feel to a sensitive guest like it had been quietly dismissed. There was one well-documented exception that guides handled with real care, a gift that clearly did not suit the evening at all, a food item that clashed with the planned menu, or a decorative object entirely wrong for the room. In these cases, a gracious hostess still thanked the guest warmly and set the item aside naturally, without drawing attention to the mismatch, protecting the giver's feelings even when the gift itself was not quite right. Grace under a small social pressure like this was considered one of the true marks of a skilled hostess. None of this was one-directional. A hostess who had been a guest herself the previous month understood exactly what was expected of her the next time she hosted, and the whole system worked because almost everyone in a given social circle had played both roles at different points. This reciprocity, everyone eventually hosting, everyone eventually gift-giving, is part of why the rules held together for as long as they did, spread across so many households with so little written enforcement behind them. Like the centerpieces before them, hostess gifts occasionally slid into a quiet competition of their own, one guest bringing something a little finer than expected, subtly raising the bar for everyone else invited to future parties in that same circle. Etiquette writers actually cautioned against this, warning that an overly extravagant gift could embarrass a hostess rather than flatter her, tipping a warm gesture into something that felt more like a display. The line between generous and showy, it turns out, worried etiquette writers just as much as it worries hosts today. As casual entertaining replaced the formal dinner party through the later decades of the 20th century, the specific choreography around gift-giving softened along with everything else. A bottle of wine still commonly changes hands at a modern gathering, but the expectation of opening it on the spot, naming it out loud, and weaving it into the evening has mostly disappeared from ordinary American hosting. What survives is the gesture. What is gone is the ritual around receiving it. One rule remains, and it is in some ways the simplest of all 8, even though it required more physical effort from a hostess than almost anything else on this list. It governed the very first seconds of the evening, before cocktails, before place cards, before any dish had been chosen, the moment a guest actually arrived at the house. Getting this part wrong undid every other careful detail before the evening had even properly begun. The rule was simple to state. A hostess greeted every single guest at the door personally, every time, without exception, rather than letting people let themselves in or wander through the house unaccompanied. It did not matter how many other things demanded her attention in the kitchen at that exact moment. The door came first, always, and the next section shows exactly how far that single habit was expected to go, right down to who took a guest's coat and where it was hung. In a properly run 1950s household, a guest never simply let themselves in, even a close friend who had visited 100 times before. The hostess, or occasionally her husband, answered the door personally for every single arrival, treating each entrance as its own small event, rather than a formality to rush through on the way back to the kitchen. This single habit set the emotional tone for the entire evening before a guest had taken a single step past the threshold. Coats were taken immediately and personally, never left for a guest to awkwardly manage themselves in a hallway closet they had never opened before. A hostess or her husband hung each coat carefully, often in a specific order or location that made retrieving it at the end of the night effortless. A small logistical kindness nobody consciously thanked her for, but everyone would have noticed instantly if it had gone wrong. Fumbling for a coat at 11 at night was considered a genuine failure of hospitality. If a guest arrived and did not know everyone already in the room, the hostess handled every introduction herself, rather than leaving a newcomer to awkwardly figure out who was who. She offered a small detail about each person as she introduced them: a shared interest, a mutual friend, a recent trip, giving the new arrival an immediate, easy way into the conversation already underway. Nobody was ever left standing alone by the punch bowl wondering how to break into a group of strangers. Even the greeting had its own small timing rules. A hostess was expected to be ready and available roughly 10 to 15 minutes before the stated start time, in case a guest arrived early, but she was also cautioned against hovering visibly at the window watching for headlights, which could make an on-time or slightly late guest feel rushed or self-conscious the moment they walked in. The goal, as always underneath every one of these rules, was to make the arrival feel unhurried, even when the hostess herself had been anything but. None of the 8 rules in this video worked in isolation, and this last one shows exactly why. A perfectly engineered seating chart meant nothing if a guest felt unwelcome the moment they walked through the door. The finest wedding china meant nothing if nobody greeted the person eating off it. Every single rule, the card, the cocktail hour, the chart, the china, the flowers, the note, the gift, and the door, existed for the same single reason: to make one specific person, for one specific evening, feel like the most important guest in the room. By the 1970s, most of this 8-part system had quietly come apart, piece by piece, for genuinely understandable reasons: more women working full-time outside the home, more families spread across greater distances from relatives who once helped host, and a culture increasingly oriented around convenience over ceremony. None of these changes were wrong. They simply left less room for an evening this carefully built, and something real was lost in the trade, even if almost nobody at the time framed it that way. Compare that 8-part system to an ordinary evening now: a phone tapped for delivery, a couch instead of a dining table, a screen instead of a seating chart engineered for conversation. Nobody is arguing the old way was easier. It clearly was not. But it was built entirely around a single idea that modern convenience quietly dropped along the way: that hosting someone well takes real, visible effort, and that the effort itself is what makes a guest feel valued rather than simply fed. Every one of these 8 secrets survives somewhere: in old etiquette books on secondhand shelves, in a grandmother's china cabinet, in a box of handwritten notes tucked into an attic trunk nobody has opened in years. None of it requires money most households do not have. What it requires is the same thing it always required: attention, paid deliberately to one specific evening and the specific people invited into it. The Parlor remembers, even when we forget, and remembering is where bringing any of it back actually has to start. None of these 8 rules ask a modern hostess to hire help or spend a fortune she does not have. They ask for exactly what they always asked for: a little planning, a little attention, and a willingness to treat an ordinary Tuesday evening as though it were worth remembering. Even borrowing one of them, greeting every guest at the door yourself, writing one real thank you note by hand, can change how an entire evening feels for everyone sitting at that table. The next section closes out everything we have walked through together tonight. Looking back at all 8 of these rules together, none of them were really about wealth, and none of them were about performing perfection for its own sake. They were about a woman deciding deliberately that the people walking through her door that evening mattered enough to prepare for, down to the smallest, most invisible detail. That is the part worth remembering long after the china patterns and the calling cards themselves have gone out of fashion for good. If any one of these 8 rituals struck a chord tonight, try reviving just one of them this month. Maybe the handwritten note, maybe simply meeting your next guest at the door yourself. Your grandmother knew how to make a room feel like home, and that knowledge was never really lost. It was just waiting for someone to pick it back up. Thank you for spending this evening in the parlor with me, and I will see you in the next one.